This is episode 14 of the Everything History podcast, Patriotism and the Rise of Political Clubs.
I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Welcome back to the Everything History podcast. Last time on the podcast, the National Constituent Assembly passed a series of constitutional reforms. Some of them were extremely radical. In particular, the Assembly's decree on church lands and the dissolution of the monasteries and convents of France. This caused religious conflict not only in France but in all of Christendom. Mainly the Catholic Church, because the Assembly had seized all of the lands and treasuries of the Church in France. And, naturally, this caused a schism between the Catholic Church and France because the National Assembly was encroaching on the Church's domain. This led to unrest throughout much of France, and France lost all future support from the Pope and other Christian leaders across Europe. This is all very complicated, but essentially, the National Assembly seemed to be going out of their way to not make any friends in Europe. This fact will come back to haunt revolutionary France in the coming years. Our story continues just before the beginning of the summer of 1790. Before we get into that already complicated year, let me make some remarks. Firstly, I am fully aware that there is a lot happening and it's sort of muddy historical waters. You're not alone. The early 1790s are an extremely complicated set of years. I say this to let you know that this stuff is dense for anybody and everybody. Also, I encourage you to ask me questions. Our good friend Google is not so reliable or knowledgeable on the French Revolution, actually. That being said, if you have any questions or want anything explained further, feel free to email me at everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com. Alright, we're going to be covering another large frame of time today, focusing in on important events here and there. Notably, we're going to discuss the abolition of the nobility, the postponement of some very important elections, patriotic displays, and the rise of political clubs in revolutionary France. Speaking of elections, as the summer approached, so too did the elections for the future government. Yes, in June and July, the active citizens were to vote on a multitude of offices. They were to vote on the new delegates for the National Assembly, which was to be called the French Legislative Assembly, if you recall. Yet these active citizens were also to elect their local judges, magistrates, and priests to serve as their provincial and local government. Oh, and if you're wondering what active citizen means, have a listen to the previous episode. Alright, as the weather warmed in France, the public began to criticize their National Assembly. Many publicly questioned if the Assembly and its deputies had overstepped their powers. Did the Assembly really have the power to destroy the Church, decide who was to vote, and apply taxation at the same time? Many newspapers were published in March, April, and May of 1790 asking those very questions, and they also questioned the motives of their Assembly deputies. Specifically, they questioned Comte de Mirabeau, who many saw as spearheading all of the Assembly's legislation. Jean-Paul Marat openly asked the purpose of Mirabeau's politics. Was France's constitution just a platform to give Mirabeau authority? And this public distrust was exacerbated further when the National Assembly, led by the always bombastic Mirabeau, decided to postpone the elections of the new French Legislative Assembly. The delegates defended themselves by pointing to the tennis court oath that they had all taken the previous year. If you recall, the tennis court oath was when the newly created National Assembly swore not to break up until a new constitution was written and ratified for France. Mirabeau successfully championed this opinion when he said that the National Assembly had been, quote, commissioned to form a constitution for France, end quote. And Mirabeau responded to the critics that spoke against the power of the National Assembly, saying, quote, if gentlemen insist on demanding when and how from simple deputies we were transformed into a National Assembly, I reply, it was on that day when, finding the hall closed and bristled with bayonets, we resorted to the first place where we could reunite to swear to perish rather than submit to such an order of things, end quote. There we hear Mirabeau referring directly to the tennis court oath from almost exactly a year prior. Mirabeau was not done, though. He added, quote, our National Assembly is above all limitation, as it is above all authority. It is accountable only to itself and can be judged only by posterity, end quote. Many citizens disagreed, but that was relatively the end of it. The National Assembly was to continue until a constitution was in place. It was then that the Assembly's leaders pursued another legislative decree. Led by the leader of the National Guard, Marquis de Lafayette, the delegates now pursued the outright abolition of nobility and all its privileges from France. If passed, the decree would be part of the new constitution. The push for the legislation was also primarily made by noble delegates, primarily the patriotic duo of Lafayette and Mirabeau. They made their case by referring back to the Declaration of Rights, which had said, quote, "Men are born free and equal in rights," end quote, and they proposed to fulfill that statement further by eliminating the nobility itself. And on June 19, 1790, the decree was passed successfully to abolish French nobility. No longer could any titles be used, quote, "Every French citizen must use only the real surname of his family," end quote. The Assembly did put in a proviso, though, making it illegal to deface any monuments, property, documents, and stuff like that used noble titles. The French government then prepared for celebration. Oh yes, they began massive preparation for a patriotic festival. It was to be grand, it was to be all-inclusive, it was to be emblematic of freedom, and it was set to occur on the anniversary of the Bastille's fall, July 14th. It was to be called the Paris Festival of Federation and was meant to be a celebration of French fraternity and patriotism. The National Assembly and the National Guard and King Louis had been trying very hard in early 1790 to build national unity. They wanted their citizens to feel French, and wanted them to unite like brothers and sisters for the cause of freedom and liberty. Thus they emphasized fraternity as something to be cherished and celebrated. This movement to build national unity started far earlier than June or July of 1790. It actually really began on February 4th when King Louis XVI addressed the National Constituent Assembly. The king had not spoken to the assembly in months, so it was a bit of a surprise when Louis arrived dressed in a simple black suit. With none of the usual royal flair or ridiculousness, Louis gave a quick speech in which he promised to act for the liberty of his people and conduct his role as a citizen king. What this meant that the king and his family were embracing constitutional governance for the sake of France's future. Whether they believed it or not is beside the point. The delegates were very pleased by this demonstration of loyalty, and Bailly, still mayor of Paris, proclaimed the king to be, quote, "Louis the Just, Louis the Good, and Louis the Wise." And this February demonstration in the National Assembly led to a wave of patriotic oath-taking. Marquis de Lafayette encouraged his National Guardsmen and the smaller citizen militias to take oaths to defend the nation, the law, the king, and liberty. For example, in western France, the guardsmen from the provinces of Anjou and Brittany swore a vow to put down petty provincial disputes for the sake of the new French nation. And soon after, in eastern France, approximately 50,000 guardsmen gathered to swear loyalty as well, but in this massive gathering, they had many unique ceremonies. These ceremonies are worth speaking of because they were primarily conducted on the banks of the Rhine River. Many of these patriotic celebrations involved children because they were to be emblematic of the future, the children I mean. Indeed, 200 small children were adopted by the National Guard to be, quote, "the future of the country." And 400 young girls dressed in white were ritually blessed at a patriotic altar, and perhaps most notable of the ceremonies was one involving 2 toddlers. One child represented Protestantism and the other Catholicism, and the 2 children were baptized together and metaphorically proclaimed fédérés and civiques. Neither of those words really translate to English, so I'm not going to bother trying. Anyways, all of these ceremonies were meant to be symbolic of the future of the nation, the righteousness of the revolutionary movement, and the peaceful union of the 2 Christian sects. It was all wishful thinking to say the least, but it seemed to be working in France. Not everyone was pleased. Many writers and printers, like mentioned earlier in the podcast, still published slander and radical pamphlets, but overall it seems that the people of France were ecstatic as summer approached, and patriotism was at an all-time high in France. Similar events continued to occur throughout May, and that is why it is of no real surprise that the National Assembly announced in June their celebration of fraternity and federation to take place on July 14th, 1790. The purpose of the Festival of Federation in Paris was to unite the citizen officials, citizen soldiers, citizen clergy with the citizens themselves. The common theme being that they were all French citizens. The festive ceremony was to take place at the parade grounds of the Champ de Mars, which translates to the Field of Mars, a direct reference to the Roman god of war, and is very famous for it is the field in front of the modern Eiffel Tower. There's a bazillion famous events that have happened there, and anyways, the parade was setting up to be a gorgeous sight to behold, and France in 1790 had 3 weeks to turn it into a temporary spectacle to display their revolutionary fervor. And work they did, for after only a few days, the Champ de Mars was ready to hold several 100,000 French citizens. Here's an account from a witness to the construction process. Quote, "I saw 150,000 citizens of all classes, ages, and sexes making the most superb picture of concord that has ever been witnessed. It is a type of spectacle so original that even the most blasé of men can hardly fail to be moved." End quote. And soon the day of celebration finally arrived, and I'll stop giving commentary and tell you the moving tale of the Paris Federation Festival of 1790. The grand day began on a down note, actually. The weather was poor, with winds and rain flowing into Paris throughout the morning and early afternoon. The celebratory parade actually was not to begin at the Champ de Mars, that was to be the conclusion. The procession actually began near the edge of the capital, with a battalion of children carrying a sign proclaiming them as, quote, "the hope of the nation." There was also bearded veterans of the Chevaliers, companies of French naval sailors, several groups of governmental officials, and leading the early procession as it set off at dawn through the streets was Marquis de Lafayette leading his 50,000 National Guardsmen. It was really an awesome spectacle, with the procession eventually extending miles behind Lafayette as they marched through the morning mist, with thousands of people cheering them on as they continued through the streets. As they passed certain markers in the city, artillery salvos were fired off, with the salvos becoming more frequent as they neared the Champ de Mars. As they neared their destination, the National Constituent Assembly also joined the march as well, and finally, at 1 p.m, the grand procession led by Lafayette on his white horse marched 8 abreast in step through an 80-foot-tall triple arch called the Arc of Triumph. And as they exited from the other side of the arc with rain, wind, and sparse sunshine greeting them, the marchers were met by the roaring cheers from 400,000 spectators. Every witness to the event said that the beat of the drums, the steady march of the processioners, the crescendo of sound was beyond compare. All accounts describe a thrilling chill of excitement run down their spines as they saw Lafayette and his National Guardsmen emerge through the Arc of Triumph. It was truly a resplendent scene. Many of the participants of the march proudly wrote of tears of joy flowing from their eyes. Everyone was filled with pride and joy as the procession continued onto the Champ de Mars. And this revolutionary and patriotic fervor was not isolated to just the French either. Many foreigners were actually there as well and described experiencing the very same emotions. The German writer Joachim Heinrich Comte was so inspired that he wrote, quote, "I wanted to fold in my arms the first persons I met. All national differences had vanished. All prejudices had disappeared." End quote. And William Wordsworth, the future British poet laureate and one of the pioneers of Romantic poetry, arrived in France on the day of the festival, and he was so overcome with emotion that he was inspired to write a series of poems on how the French patriotism and revolution made him feel. And here I will recite a short bit of Wordsworth. "Upon our side, us who were strong in love, bliss it was in that dawn to be alive. But to be young was very heaven, O times in which the meagre, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute took at once the attraction of a country in romance." And after another ecstatic 2 hours, talking again of the festival, the official ceremonies of the day began at around 3:30 in the afternoon. Bishop Talleyrand rose and conducted mass and benediction for the crowd present, and Talleyrand proclaimed, quote, "Sing and weep tears of joy, for on this day France has been made anew." Talleyrand then gave the stage to the ever-theatrical Lafayette, who proceeded to the King's Royal Pavilion, where he conducted an oath ceremony with his National Guardsmen. Lafayette stretched his arms to heaven, unsheathed his sword, touched his blade to the altar in imitation of the French knights of old, and had his soldiers swear to uphold the French nation, the law, and the king. King Louis XVI then completed the ceremony when he rose and said, quote, "As King of the French, I swear to employ all the powers delegated to me by the Constitution to uphold the decrees of the National Assembly." End quote. And with that, the ceremony was complete, and the gathered citizens left singing songs of fraternity, brotherhood, and sisterhood. It appeared that France was finally united and that their future greatness and freedom was at last secure. But actually, by that very time next year, spoiler alert, the French nation was to be in ruins once more. Okay, as I move along, I'm going to actually quickly summarize the rest of 1790 because I need to talk about larger developments, not trivial historical details. From July to the end of 1790, almost everything got worse in some small measure. Patriotism faded away quickly and the governmental progress grinded to a halt. In August, groups of former nobles and other citizens loyal to the old regime in the House of Bourbon began to meet in secret in southern and western France. It turns out that not many people were actually happy, and counter-revolutionary forces began to scheme in August, September, and October of 1790. They wanted to take their country back. They believed the National Assembly had been conducting affairs far too radically. And also in September, the National Assembly began instituting their local government structure, and as this was happening in late 1790, many aristocrats, clergymen, and sometimes just scared citizens decided to pack up their bags and leave the country for good. These émigrés or immigrants were rising in numbers every month, even after it was made illegal by the Assembly. And throughout November, counter-revolutionaries began to riot against the National Assembly, hoping for the return of King Louis XVI as an absolute monarch. These small revolts and riots were put down quickly, but it was becoming clear by the end of 1790 that France was very unstable. Nobody knew how bad, but chaos and anarchy seemed to be looming over the French people again. That is essentially a quick summary of France in late 1790, which allows me to talk about larger and, dare I say, more important developments. Indeed, like much of history, the really important stuff does not always appear on the timeline. I'm talking about the history that happens behind the scenes and unfolds over months and often even years. Right now, I need to explain the rise of political clubs in France. It is a very broad and very complex topic, which is why it doesn't really show up in a timeline. Alright, I'll use a roundabout method to explain the political clubs. You see, by late 1790, all political unity in the National Constituent Assembly had broken down and disappeared. This occurred due to various reasons and factors, but the most notable reason is the expansion of the political clubs. First, it is worth defining exactly what a political club is. A political club is a social group where like-minded individuals gather to discuss politics. Membership to one of these clubs was almost always restricted, not open to the public, and involved many requirements that varied from club to club. Let me make this clear, political clubs are distinct from political parties. They are very similar, yes, but political clubs as I have defined them have the capacity to be far more insidious than political parties. This is an opinion, so allow me to defend my statement. Most political parties are open to membership without any fees, dues, or rituals. Political clubs are private. There's a big difference because these political clubs, which are not government institutions, can conduct their discussions behind closed doors. This can be done with political parties, sort of like the Know Nothing Party in antebellum America, but it is far more difficult because political parties are trying to get votes, while political clubs are trying to influence legislation and the government itself. Here, let me provide you with a hypothetical example to show you the dangers of political clubs. If a bunch of high-level bankers got together, pooled their resources, and met periodically at an unknown location to talk politics, that would be a dangerous political club. This is what scares people about the so-called Illuminati and what used to scare people about the Catholic Church, the Knights Templar, and the Freemasons. So what if one of these dangerous political clubs actually gained enough power, wealth, and influence to manipulate an entire country? Well, that may sound like a conspiracy theory, but that is exactly what is going to happen in France. Indeed, France will soon become a real-life historical example of a massive political conspiracy that occurred not by careful, evil planning, but by happenstance and a series of unfortunate events. I'm getting ahead of myself again. Allow me to actually explain the rise of French political clubs. It began innocently enough during the Estates General of 1789. About 40 of the delegates began to meet at local cafes before and after meetings of the Estates General. This gathering quickly became known as the Breton Club, and after a few weeks the Breton Club gained dozens of new members that included the likes of Mirabeau, Le Chapelier, Sieyès, and Robespierre. However, after the creation of the National Assembly and the other momentous events in the summer of 1789, the Breton Club all but disappeared until October of 1789. After the Women's March, a small group of delegates began meeting again in private. They formally renamed themselves the, quote, Society of the Friends of the Constitution. However, by early 1790, the society became known as the Jacobin Club, which was actually meant to be an insult, but the club leaders sort of embraced the Jacobin name. So, formally they were still known as the Society of the Friends of the Constitution, but everyone began referring to them as the Jacobins. And the Jacobin Club was very exclusive. In late 1789, members had to be National Assembly delegates, but by the spring of 1790, the requirements were slackened a little bit, so that you only had to be an active citizen and pay the 24 livres annual fee. Still, this meant that the Jacobins were made up of only middle and upper class citizens. The power of the Jacobin Club increased monumentally during 1790, and by the summer they had 1,500 members, and their status rivaled that of the National Constituent Assembly itself. Yet, in April of 1790, another political club rose up in opposition to the Jacobins. These conservative delegates and citizens formed the political club known as the Society of 1789. The Society of 1789 valued constitutional governance, tradition, and the preservation of the monarchy. This political club was led by very notable men including Lafayette, Mirabeau, and Le Chapelier. Also around the same time, another club also formed called the Society of the Friends of the Rights of Man. This club was extremely radical in their views. They wanted no part of the monarchy to exist, and they believed that all citizens should be active citizens, and their membership was open to the public. So by late 1790, those were the three primary political clubs in France. Number one, the Jacobins, who were becoming extremely influential and were made up so far of both radicals and conservatives. Number two, the Society of 1789, who believed in a constitutional monarchy and promoted tradition alongside liberty. And number three, the Society of the Friends of the Rights of Man, which was a radical populist political club. And I have to leave it there, but next episode I will explain these political clubs and factions a little bit further and describe the fracturing of the Jacobins. And I will also address why France was still so unstable as a nation. And if you liked what you heard, make sure to subscribe on iTunes, and if you have any questions, concerns, or corrections, send them my way at everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.